So I was actually just looking back through the chat, and I think there was one other question that would probably be good for us to discuss,
Yeah.
since this is something that I took me a while to develop out too, is how do you actually figure out what's a reasonable timeline from Dr. Nathan-san? So I'm interested to hear how you guys do it as well. For me, generally, I will take, you know, whenever my end date is, if there's something more firm, like, okay, I need to have this abstract in by a certain conference, or this is a time sensitive, like COVID, our research is going to be a little more time restricted than it might be for things like that could go on for a year or two and probably not impact practices but is meaningfully. So I figure out what my absolute end is. I need to have it done by this time. And if I don't, then I'll try to come up with a reasonable timeline of roughly 3 to 4 months. Because after 3 to 4 months, you have those projects that dwindle forever. So I try to feel like, all right, within 3 to 4 months, we should probably have an end for this at least reasonable stage, whether it be a launch of a project or writing up a paper. And then just work back step by step from there. Usually I'll use about 2-week increments. For something larger, like writing up a whole section of paper, I might stretch out to 1 to 2 months. And then again, kind of like I mentioned earlier, I just negotiate with the team and say, does this seem reasonable to you? Is this something that, you know, I'm being overly ambitious with, or is your schedule actually really open? If I make this, we actually had a project that Dr. Haas and I were working on, where we realized that if we stretched out too far, it actually was going to be more complicated because it would have overlapped with interview season. So instead, we actually made the deadlines a little bit earlier, so it wasn't going to fall on a really busy time of year. So sometimes just negotiating what works best for people during different times of year. How do you guys develop your deadlines or timelines?
Mary, any thoughts?
I think it depends on what I'm writing about. If it's a perspectives piece or something that's very timely, and I feel like other people may have a similar idea and be writing something similar, there's a little bit more time pressure to get it done quickly. So I had with COVID, for instance, as a good example of that. So for those papers that naturally shorten the timeline to more of like a 2-week period, I feel like the sweet spot is probably 1 to 2 months, where people, because I agree with you exactly, Mike. If it drags out too long, it just dies. There has to be like some time pressure to help get rid of the inertia. But I feel like 2 months is usually good, so that if people have other things going on in their life, they can kind of work around them to contribute at some point. And then if I have a lot of other projects going on that are relatively more time sensitive, and I have another project that's less time sensitive, but I still kind of want to keep doing, I'll sometimes just let things go a little bit slower, just by the nature of recognizing I can't do everything fast. And sometimes you can sacrifice, you know, quality for speed. So it really depends on the project, who I'm working with, how timely and time sensitive it is, and how busy I am with other things that are more time sensitive.
Yeah, 100% I agree with you. I think there's different sizes of projects, right? So something that is, you know, multi-year collaboration where you're gathering data for like 3 years, you might have some periodic, what I call paper sprints, where you kind of lock down a study protocol, and then you lock down like a really good intro, right? Because you've already got the grant proposal. And so you kind of, I try to like have a running paper in the background through the process of an entire kind of like arc of a research study. It may not be the case so much if you're doing a commentary, like you said. Those you can really sprint. Like you basically put an outline down and just write it, right? Like, so Mike's been a champ taking us through some in like 2 weeks, and Mary, we've done ones that are like 1.5 weeks or something like that. But that doesn't have any data, so you're not. But I do find for some of the bigger projects, you might have a slower burn over time. And so I do find that I try to do the multiple wins thing, which is if I'm writing a study protocol, you know, like it's a small pivot to also turn that in as a grant. It's a small pivot to then take the past tense of both of those documents and turn it into your intro and methods section. And so really, as you're doing your science and the data is collecting in the background, you can actually be like half done your paper. And then and if you're doing hypothetical deductive, like positivist, like, you know, quantitative work, you kind of already have your discussion. You may have your results. It'll just be like, was it significant or not? Like there's a little bit of toggling, but you've kind of already got the storyboard for your whole paper by the time you've set up your study. slightly different battle with qualitative, and that probably needs its own webinar about how to write qualitative papers, because I'm still, struggling through that myself. But I think those are all things that you can consider. And then I think Srija's next question, thanks for asking that question, is, like, how do you actually strategize how you get multiple projects done? Because in the ideal situation, you're working on one paper at a time. But just like in the emergency department, when I'm working clinically, I don't see one patient at a time. I'm usually bouncing between projects. And for the aforementioned reasons, some of them I've been working on this for like 3 years, and we're still collecting data. And it finally comes to a head, and we can like finally write this all up because our data collection is over, versus another paper that just opportunistically comes up and we just want to get it out. How do you like sort between them? That's a really great question. I don't think I have it solved yet. I was just reflecting with some of my collaborators that I'm very reactive these days. I'm basically bouncing from, postdoc fellow to med student to collaborator, and getting emails from Mike and Mary like, where are we at with this? And I'm just basically putting out fires right now because I've got so much on the go. At last count, I've got like 40 something different projects on the go, with a lot of them actually in the final writing stage and submitted right now. So like I've been kind of on a big writing binge, right? And so I'm kind of like the worst person to ask right now. I usually like to be a little bit better planned out in my attack, but for some reason, because of delays, because of opportunities, I've got like all these papers clustering into me at once. And that's not where I like to do it. I like to try to space things out a little bit more. Ideally, I usually keep tabs, and before I submit another paper to another journal, I will actually hold back until some of them have cleared from the revise and resubmit. Unfortunately, right now I can't do that. And I don't know if it's because I'm more senior now or COVID. It has just completely destroyed the way that we're writing right now. But it is something that I try to bear in mind, is like how do I put it? Deploy the papers at different speeds and not take on anything new until I've cleared out some of the old stuff. It's not working for me lately right now. So I'd love to hear what Yusuf or Mary or Mike, what do you guys have as pearls for that?
I think our method running the papers weekly is kind of quite strategy, because we are freshing up every week, like what is the current state of this paper and what are we going to do until the next week checkpoint. So these are like working out, and now we are moving from mail to Slack channels, which helping us to like track changes like more instantly. So this kind of strategies is helpful.
Yeah. So what Yusuf's talking about is that I have a tradition when I haven't been so reactive and don't have like wonderful people like Mike and Yusuf and Mary all bothering me, is that I often try to keep tabs on all my projects. And Yusuf and I do this with our projects together, and we actually run the list. It's kind of like rounding on your patients if you're a clinician. It's like that Monday morning, like, okay, everybody, let's go on round on all our patients. It's a very similar phenomenon, right? Like, it's like, okay, so what are we going to do for that person to get Mrs. Smith home, right? Like, it's a very similar phenomenon. It's like, okay, that paper, what's going to get that paper out, right? Like Smith is now the author, not, Mrs. Smith is Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith is the, junior first author on the paper. Like, okay, so how are we going to bring Mary Smith's paper home now, right? Like, how are we going to get it out into the, what's our journal, right? And so it's very much an analogy to the way that we do. And I try to speak that way with clinicians, because often you already have that time management skill set that you have, right? And so just like you would if you're an inpatient ward full of patients, or an emergency department full of patients, there are some patients that are going to take a while. They actually probably need to be admitted, and so like they're going to be, you're going to do what you can for them, and then they get admitted. That'd be like, you do your protocol, you set the data collection, and we're gathering data now for 3 years, right? Like, that's going to be a very different process, and then you'll need to remember to come back to them later. Versus, like, you have someone that probably needs to be admitted overnight for observation, and then their ethanol level will be an adequate level in the morning, and they will be able to safely go home, right? And so each of these things is a slightly different kind of arc to them. And I think that rounding on your papers, getting a habit of doing it once, depending on how busy you are, once a week, as Yusuf and I are doing right now, roughly. Or, if you have a more relaxed schedule of scholarship, like maybe you're not working on 40 something projects, that's okay. And you're only doing like 3, then maybe once a month is good, depending on, like the running memory bank that you have.
One thing that I found somewhat more helpful for this is figuring out where I'm the rate limiting step and where someone else is going to be the rate limiting step. And so if it turns out that it's something relatively simple for me to do, even though if I could do it a couple weeks later, if it's something that I can do, get my piece done with, and that's going to allow other people to work on the project, then I might preferentially slide that project up so then other people have a couple weeks to work on it. And then it's off my plate, so it drops down my to-do list, and it helps the project get done a little quicker. So I will usually try to figure out if there's something where I'm inhibiting other people from doing work, how can I get that piece done first? The other thing I usually try to do, and this is probably just from my own psyche, is like if I have a project that that's really a lot of work and it's really kind of weighing on me, like I need to get this thing done. I think my intrinsic nature is to try to say, well, then I'm just not going to do it right now. I'm going to do all these other really easy things. Like I'm going to go through my email and delete all the spam messages. And I'm going to go through my, my calendar and make sure all the calendar things are up to date and find all these like menial tasks that don't really benefit anything, just so I don't have to do the bigger task. And I kind of catch myself and say, no, all right, this thing is going to be a time sink, but I'm going to give up, 2-3 hours and really focus and get this thing done. And I feel like this kind of uplifting afterwards of like, okay, that big kind of boulder on my shoulder is now gone, and it makes the other projects easier to do. And I just feel overall a little bit more relaxed about it. So I generally try to, identify what that big impediment is. Exactly. I eat the live frog first and try to get that piece at least done with, and it makes everything else go much quicker.
Yeah, and sometimes the live frog is, let's say, not as disgusting as you thought it would be. Like it's not as hard to swallow. Sometimes we build things up when we're writing. I kind of see some of my colleagues, they need to like have the entire afternoon off, and they have to have this ritual where they have to have the right brew of coffee and it has to be in the right mug. And there's this like ritual to writing. And for those of us who write more often, I would say that we probably have trained ourselves for various techniques that you can kind of look at, just task switch into writing whenever you have time. So between 2 Zoom meetings right now, like I might write a paragraph or 2 on something. I'll just make sure it's there as soon as I close Zoom. I'm like, oh, yep, I gotta write that paragraph for Mike. And I try to do it in stepwise manner so that I can get it done, right? So I think that some of those strategies are really fitting it in where you can, knowing that you have to have a really good outline. So where I spend a lot of time actually is that storyboard or the outline of the paper to make sure my logic was coherent. And anyone that knows me knows I always carry a pack of sticky notes around. And because I'm not a very organized mind, and so in my beautiful mind, I guess, I'm sometimes very chaotic in the way that I think about things. And so what I do is I actually take a whole bunch of Post-it notes, like sticky notes, and I write 1 thought per sticky note. And they don't come in order. They are definitely disordered. But what I do after I've brainstormed everything out into sticky notes, and you can do this in text, like you can Google Jamboard if you want to do it, but I organize it in order then. And I put headings like intro, methods, results, discussion. And I organize my stickies into those piles under those headings of the paper. And then after that, what I do is I actually lay it all out in the order that it should make sense. And I fill in the blanks because sometimes there'll be a logical gap, right? And so it is inspired by things like design thinking, like Antonia's pointing out, or quite frankly, like Pixar. Like it's like how you would put together an animated cartoon. Like you're going to divide and conquer in the end. But as long as everyone knows that Nemo has to be found in the end, well, we kind of know where we're going, right? And we know, what detours that, like the little robot takes and what friends the monsters find along the way, right? Those are the kind of things that you can program into the script of basically your paper so that everyone else can follow where you're going. And so that way, especially with collaboration, this outline is really important. So just like in Pixar, you need to make sure that outline is really important, and then you can all work around it piecemeal a little bit at a time. So that, I mean, that kind of brings us back to that collaborative writing kind of stance, which is, yeah, there's a lot of projects, but many hands make light work, right? And so having lots of people on deck to be able to share in that burden makes it more enjoyable and less misery to be writing together.